folks. We'll start events off. My name is Alan Kuperman. I'm an assistant professor here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I want to thank you all for coming today to hear our talk by Jane Holl Lute on current challenges in UN peacekeeping. I will introduce the Assistant Secretary General in a moment, but first I would like to thank a few folks, our sponsors, the Strauss Center at the University of Texas, and especially Betty Sue and the LBJ Library for hosting us in these very impressive surroundings for the entire international security speaker series this semester, last semester, next semester. We really do appreciate it, Betty Sue. Oh, we didn't tell you that next semester? Well, now it's on TV, so it must be true. Our speaker today, Jane Holl Lute. I've actually never met her before today, but I feel like I know her because I've been following her work for so long. But not only did I not meet her till today, but I actually wasn't aware of how impressive her background is until I started to read up on her. She has done a lot of stuff in a very short amount of time. And she's not old, and that's what makes it so remarkable. I can't go through it all, but let me just give you a taste of it. She was a career Army officer, including holding command positions, including being involved in Operation Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf War, including teaching at West Point. Along the way, she picked up, a few degrees. She seems to pick up academic degrees like I pick up colds. Which I have one at the moment. Sorry about that. She has a J.D. Law degree from Georgetown University and a Ph.D. in political science from Stanford University. And as I tell my students, you think very hard before you go get think about getting a Ph.D. because the average length of time is 8 to 9 years, and that's of the people who finish, and only half the people finish. But this is what we call an outlier, because she finished in 3 years. Okay. She was at the National Security Council, U.S. National Security Council, for 3 years as Director for European Affairs. That overlapped the first Bush administration and the Clinton administration, and has been focused on peacekeeping type things for over a decade, and that's really where I've come to know her work, and especially the 5 years she spent heading up the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict. And this was a very, very important private initiative in the 90s when we started to awake to ethnic conflict and genocide and ethnic cleansing and the potential for peacekeeping and so forth. And this was a project whose argument was that if we thought about this very hard, and I assume you won't be speaking too much on the Carnegie, so I hope I'm not stepping on your toes, but the idea was if we thought about this very hard, we might come up with ways of preventing, averting, mitigating the amount of death and destruction from these sorts of usually internal wars. And a whole series of publications came out of this, and they're still, as we talked about earlier, still quite timely. Let's say there's a lot of lessons in those that still haven't been incorporated into our institutions. Her current position, and the position from which she will be giving her talk tonight, is as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for Peacekeeping Operations, with specific responsibilities for personnel, finance, and logistical support to mount and sustain UN peace operations around the world. And as she will tell you in just a few moments, that's a lot of operations involving a lot of troops in a lot of countries and truly around the world. So without any further ado, I give you Jane Holl Lute.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's both inspiring and intimidating to be in a serious academic audience. Not only because of people to my right and to my left, especially Jim Steinberg, someone whom I hold in absolutely the highest regard, and many friendly faces around the room, It's inspiring because it reminds one that you have an obligation, I think, given the privilege that we have been born to as Americans, or by virtue of whatever fact have brought us to this room tonight, to continue to learn and to continue to understand how our experiences matter really, not just in the instant that they happen, but over the long term. I have the special privilege to be associated with United Nations Peacekeeping. I'm a peacekeeper. They're not just soldiers, they're civilians, and I'll talk a little bit about the special combination when soldier and civilian comes together in peacekeeping. It's intimidating because an academic audience, they're known for thinking very rigorously, very carefully, very systematically, very hard about hard subjects. I don't do anything that's hard. So let me just ask you to walk with me as I talk to you a little bit about what it means to be a peacekeeper today. What challenges the United Nations faces as it confronts conflicts winding down around the world, and the call of the international community, because it is a call, and it is from the international community, which reaches deep into the heart of the Charter of the United Nations, which begins with the preambulatory words, "We the peoples of the United Nations, in order to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime," and it carries on from there. Peacekeeping represents, in some very fundamental way, the greatest aspiration and a living manifestation of our shared humanity and commitment to pool strength to share burdens. So I thought I would talk about the challenges of peacekeeping, addressing both its aspirational aspects, maybe touching on a few conceptual aspects. What distinguishes peacekeeping, for example, from development work, or from an invasion, for that matter, or from pure humanitarianism. Talk a little bit about the limitations and the strategic compression that exists in the world today regarding legitimate use of force in our context. What is it a peacekeeping mission is designed to do? And examine a little bit the international community's approach, or theories of remedy when they throw a peacekeeping mission at a problem and hope that it works. As Gordon Sullivan, former Chief of Staff of the Army, was fond of saying, hope is not a method. But peacekeeping seems to be in the hands of some. And we know that a little information and a little capability in the hands of the eager can be a dangerous thing. But it can also be a powerful thing. And at its best, peacekeeping is a very powerful thing that the international community brings to bear. I thought I would share with you a little bit about what it actually takes to mount and sustain an operation. And then just conclude with some of the ways we know we're succeeding and some of the reasons we think we don't succeed when we do fail, and we have failed famously, notoriously, tragically in the past. And just conclude maybe the way I will begin by saluting the men and women who are peacekeepers around the world. We often salute our soldiers, rightfully so. I was a soldier. I'm married to a soldier. I'm proud of the American soldier. I'm proud of the fact that I come out of that tradition, and it is the tradition in which I was trained and I know. And very powerfully, I think, bring that knowledge and commitment and passion and understanding of things to the work that I do at the United Nations, and it is broadly embraced. The tradition of the soldier, in many ways, is the tradition of the peacekeeper. So let me salute the young men and women, and the old men and women, and all of us who are doing what we can to make the world a better place. The challenge of modern peacekeeping, though, or peacekeeping today, I think, is really not very well understood. In fact, I'm always often more impressed by what people don't know about peacekeeping rather than what they do know. They do know that we wear blue helmets. They may not know that UN Peacekeeping represents the second largest deployed military presence in the world. There are right now about 100,000 peacekeepers around the world in 18 missions. In addition, we support another 13 special political missions. There are over 120 nationalities represented in UN peacekeeping. In the Congo alone, in MONUC, our mission in the Congo, there are over 100 nationalities represented on staff. But while there are about 100,000 peacekeepers on the ground right now, the UN Department of Peacekeeping manages about twice that number, nearly 200,000 soldiers in the field and civilians in the field on an annualized basis, given the fact that they rotate every 6 months or every 12 months. We turn over 1/3 of our civilian staff every single year. 50% of the staff, the international staff in the year, the international staff in the field have fewer than 2 years of experience in the United Nations. When I first started at the UN in 2003, the budget of peacekeeping was $1.8 billion. We will be over $7 billion, going to $9 billion. The mission in Lebanon that we are currently starting up, simultaneous to the startup of a renewed mission in East Timor and a new mission in Nepal, Lebanon is 9, Timor is 10, 11 is 12, Nepal is 11. Darfur will be 12 if we go there. Chad, and Central African Republic, which we have been asked to put an advanced mission in place, will be 13. If we go to Somalia, that will be 14. That's since I started at the UN fewer than 4 years ago. The UN is overstretched for sure, but it is also oversubscribed. And there is no, at some level, saying no. But I think we have to be realistic about what the capabilities are, the conditions under which it makes sense to deploy peacekeepers to help solve a problem, and when it may not. The operational challenges of peacekeeping are also enormous. We have literally tens of thousands of people in the field moving every single day. I have over 200 aircraft. We have literally tens of thousands of transactional contracts and procurement and all kinds of commercial transactions. And I can tell you we have no peacekeeping missions in Paris. Okay, we have all of our peacekeeping missions are in often the most remote, most dangerous, most difficult places on the planet. And there are lines of communication that are hundreds of kilometers long. No water, no infrastructure, no housing. It is as difficult and austere and as far-cast an environment as it is possible to imagine, especially when the requirement exists to make the place better than when you came, especially when the requirement exists to exert a coherent grip on command and control, when units are come from widely dispersed militaries and cover vast ranges. We have a brigade in the eastern Congo. A brigade is about 5,000 guys. We have a brigade in the eastern Congo whose area of responsibility is larger than Rwanda and Burundi combined. They measure their operational readiness rate in shoe leather because it's the only way to cover their territory. This is an enormous undertaking of enormous difficulty and enormous complexity. Well, what problems are peacekeeping missions designed to fix? Because they exist in a variety of circumstances. There are interpositional missions, like the old-fashioned kind of peacekeeping that you know, that exists, for example, in the Kashmir region. There are observer missions, and there are more robust missions, as we have in Congo, Liberia, and Sudan. And these missions are given enormous challenges that run the gamut of political, economic, and social recovery and security, policing, law and order, the restoration of order when it breaks down, given these kinds of tasks. But fundamentally, the mission of peacekeeping and why the world needs peacekeepers is to protect and strengthen fragile peace. That is the purpose of a peacekeeper, to protect and strengthen fragile peace. Now, this is not truth or wisdom. This is my version of what it is we do. But I think it speaks to the heart of why and when the world needs peacekeepers, because the need exists from time to time to protect and strengthen fragile peace. We need to help create the conditions for definitive recovery from conflict, and it is possible to do this. You know, we're all familiar, I think, with Paul Collier's work that says 50% of all conflicts revert to violence once a peace has been achieved. Well, that's true, except when it's not. And it's obviously not true in the other 50% of the cases. So what's going on there? We need to know why some peace is durable and some peace is not. And more times than not, I think as Jim Dobbin's book and others have found, that the UN contributes to creating a durable peace, not to confuse ultimate ownership for who owns the circumstances on the ground. The other imperative, obviously, for peacekeeping is to control cost. There are the cynical among us who say, when the Security Council decides to deploy a peacekeeping mission on the ground, it's really only solving one problem. And that problem is that the levels of violence in a particular situation have become unacceptably high. But in my view, that is overly cynical. A peacekeeping mission is sent in because the help of the international community is needed. We need to bring it to bear because, as we know, peace will not keep itself. And often formerly warring parties, while they are committed to a process and committed to a pattern of prospective satisfaction of grievances as opposed to a retrospective accounting of score settling. When that exists, a condition is ripe for peacekeepers to come help strengthen and protect that fragile peace. So, the real issue then for peacekeeping is what has to be done. When we put a force in on the ground, what do we need to do? What actually are they doing every single day? Fundamentally, if we're going to protect and strengthen fragile peace, it means we need a society that is capable of governing itself, managing the relations of its citizens at home and abroad with its neighbors in relative peace. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is a capable state. Now, this is an idea that actually had its roots in the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict. How do you prevent the outbreak of violence? How do you prevent the spread of violence? Or how do you prevent the reemergence of violence once a peace has been achieved? In large part, you can do that by structurally engaging to help create a capable society, helping to create a capable state, a state that can deliver security, well-being, and justice under the rule of law for its citizens. What does security mean? At some level, it means control over borders. At some level, it means that the government is the sole legitimate authority over lethality within those borders. And at some level, it means that the security institutions of the state, both domestically and internationally, are legitimate, capable, and have the kind of responsiveness to governmental authority that we expect it to have and we recognize in the most stable societies. What does well-being mean? Well-being means fundamentally health, education, and access to opportunity. What does justice mean? Justice means a lot of things to a lot of people. And we live in an age when there's enormous normative compression on all of these words, all of these ideas, as the international community engages in a problem, in an effort to help solve a problem. Justice at some very fundamental level is responsive governance. You might say there is no more fundamental a political right than a say in how you're governed. Justice is also a regulatory framework that allows us to engage in predictable behaviors. We all don't have to get along, as long as we all know that we will operate within the boundaries of a regulatory framework more or less most of the time, and that if we don't, there are equitable and predictable enforcement mechanisms that we as a society can sustain with ourselves. These are, again, in my view, the attributes of a capable state, a capable government, a capable society. This is the goal in the aftermath of a conflict, when particularly for the kinds of conflicts where peacekeeping is engaged, societies have not been at war with strangers. Societies have not been at war with far-flung adversaries. They've been at war with themselves, sometimes for generations. And it takes a special kind of sustained engagement to help create the conditions for durable recovery from that kind of conflict. Well, who can do this work? NGOs, of course, can do it. They do it. They're enormously visible, present, active, and engaged, and consequential and influential all over the world, particularly in conflict zones. Governments can do it, and they do it. Regional organizations can do it, and the UN can do it. There are hundreds of NGOs. There are dozens of governments. There's a handful of regional organizations, but there's only one UN. And I'll talk about a little bit why the UN brings particular attributes to bear when it engages in something like peacekeeping. But how do we know peacekeeping? Why do we do it? When do we do it? How do we distinguish peacekeeping from, how do we know it's not just development work? It's not just development work because it comes armed and equipped with hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of soldiers. And increasingly, large formed military, or not military rather, but police units, formed police units to address law and order questions. Thousands of them now in the field. This is a relatively new development in peacekeeping, but one that we think has a lot of promise as the UN helps engage in restoring law and order to a society and in helping build the institutions to maintain that law and order. Peacekeeping is distinguished from an attack or an invasion because of the degree of legitimacy that it enjoys by virtue of the decisions of the Council, the Security Council, which I'll talk about. And this is not just a handful of member states, even the permanent members who have arrogated to themselves some special power. This is power vested in the Council by under the provisions of Article 24 of the UN Charter, which says the UN Security Council has the responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And under the provisions of Article 25, the member states of the UN agree to be bound by its decisions. So there is an extraordinary degree of legitimacy when the UN engages with a peacekeeping mission. How does it differ? Peacekeeping differ from a humanitarian mission? Can peacekeepers occupy humanitarian space? In this regard, I suppose I fall down in the same area that ICRC does. Humanitarianism is the act, not the actor. Nevertheless, peacekeeping is distinguished from humanitarianism. The humanitarians have an agenda of emergency well-being. They're designed to come in quickly when society is under extraordinary stress and bring those aspects that are necessary to ensure emergency well-being: water, food, shelter, protection. And I can tell you, quite interestingly, that I have observed firsthand, information. It is not the case that vulnerable populations are clueless populations. They're extremely well-informed and they want to stay informed. And so information has become as important a commodity in addressing the emergency humanitarian needs of a population as not almost as any of the other things, and I suppose Maslow is still alive and well, but it is an important factor. How does peacekeeping distinguish itself from the development community? The development community has a core agenda of sustainable self-governance. What they're trying to do is create the capacity, the legitimacy, and the financial independence, quite frankly, of society and government to lead itself. Theirs is this agenda of sustainable self-governance that is ultimately measured not in their success, but what the society and leadership is able to do on its own behalf. What's the role of peacekeepers? As I said, protect and strengthen fragile peace. But our job really is to create an environment of transitional security. That means we go in, we stay, we do our job. It can be quite an expansive job, as I'll talk about. And then we get out. But again, an important aspect that distinguishes peacekeeping from all other kinds of international engagements in conflict zones is the role and the purpose of force. So let me turn for a minute to this question, because I think it's a vexing one. What is force good for fixing? You know, I don't think in the international community we have very good theories of remedy when it comes to the use of force. You know, when you go to a doctor and you say, "Hey, doc, I'm sick, give me something," you're hoping that whatever she prescribes is somehow remotely connected to what's wrong with you. Because she's got a good theory of remedy going on. This will fix you because I know what's wrong. We don't always know what's wrong when we throw force at a problem. And we do throw force and forces at a problem all the time. But I think that there are three real purposes for effective use of force. Maybe there are 400, but I tell you, I don't do anything that's hard. So this is a fairly simple, maybe simplistic framework. I think force is effective really for three purposes. Uphold the rule of law, to draw clear lines against unacceptable behavior, and when the destruction of a pernicious evil is really the only answer. And yes, I do believe that there are some evils in the world for which the destruction is the only viable remedy. And I think we can all imagine examples of that. To me, those are effective purposes to which force can be put. But what are legitimate uses for doing those things? Is any and all application of force for those purposes legitimate? And why does legitimacy matter? In my view, force is legitimate really only under three conditions, I think, today, after a long, uneven, tortuous series of evolutions in international thinking and practice over more than 2 centuries, certainly, generally, but explicitly, I think, over the past couple of centuries. That force is really seen in the international community by people around the world, by thoughtful observers and people who are just who don't preoccupy themselves with this issue, but have a sensibility about the legitimate use of force. Force is okay, it's legitimate, if you are attacked, if you are asked as part of a collective defense regime, or if it's otherwise allowed under the provisions of the Charter. Now, the provisions of the Charter, we're talking about Chapter 7 here, are actually quite extensive and can be quite expansive. But by and large, these are seen as the legitimate uses of force. Why is legitimacy important? I think some of the academics in this room might say because it reduces transaction costs. And I think we all know what that means. If your engagement using force has a stamp of legitimacy by virtue of falling under one of the three categories that I mentioned, it eases your ability and the ambit within which you can operate using force. I think it also helps validate the outcomes. If people believe at the outset that not only what you were trying to do, but how you were going about it was legitimate, it validates, in a sense, the outcomes that you achieve. And it ends up also, I think, legitimacy works to help distribute the burden of action and, importantly, follow-up. You may not have a lot of partners when you act in the use of force, but you will have many more partners who are willing to follow up in the aftermath of that use, as it always has. So when is it right for peacekeeping? If these are effective uses of force and these are legitimate conditions under which force is used, what are the right conditions? When is it right to send peacekeepers into a setting? As I mentioned, I think the core mission of peacekeepers is to protect and strengthen fragile peace. Excuse me. It means there must be a peace to keep. It means fundamentally there must be a peace to keep. There must be a viable process to which the major parties of a belligerency have committed themselves. Again, we all don't have to get along here. But if the principal parties to a belligerency have committed themselves to a political process for moving their dispute forward via nonviolent means, that process can be usefully supported by peacekeepers. It cannot be substituted by peacekeepers. There must be a peace to keep. There must be a viable political process. There must be a unified council, Security Council, in decisions that will support the introduction of a peacekeeping mission, the definition of its mandate, the extensiveness of that mandate, and its durability in the setting to which it's put. Key neighbors need to be on board. I'll talk about why this is so important later. None of the conflicts that we address through UN peacekeeping exist in splendid isolation. There's plenty of help going on, of all kinds, of belligerents themselves, of arms, of weapons, of cash. There is no splendid isolation, conflict existing as if in a vacuum tube. Ideally, there is the consent of the parties, of all parties to a belligerency. And then finally, what we need to succeed is a willing set of troop-contributing countries and financial contributing countries. And by the way, those are not the same lists. The top 10 financial contributors to UN peacekeeping and the top 10 troop-contributing countries to peacekeeping are two separate lists. But they are lists of countries that recognize that they have a common interest in coming together in peacekeeping. But it is an open question whether the world is comfortable with this distribution of labor as it has emerged in peacekeeping. How are operations put together? How do we do this? Is there a manual on the shelf that we pull down and say, Peacekeeping 101, Chapter 1, Assessment? No, there is not. Remarkably, peacekeeping, some people say peacekeeping is 60 years old and the Department of Peacekeeping is 13 or 14 years old. Other people say, no, the department is 1 year old for the 14th time. That's not true. But there has not been quite the accumulation of knowledge and experience and institutionalization of that knowledge and experience in ways that you might find familiar in other settings. Operations are put together initially because the Council, the Security Council, has become seized of a problem via a variety of mechanisms. The Secretary General, under his Article 99 authorities, can bring matters to the Council's attention. Other member states can bring it. Problems coalesce in relatively clear ways that people at least can see if they can't always predict and control. And the Council makes a determination that it will consider putting in a peacekeeping mission on the ground. Very often an instruction is sent to the Secretary General via a letter from the President of the Council to begin preparations for planning. Not to plan, not to prepare, but to begin preparations for planning. Why? But it's very important. One of the very deep-seated themes running through the United Nations is that it is an organization of the member states, and it's inappropriate and wrong for the international bureaucrats who make up the Secretariat to prejudge the prerogatives of those member states through the sheer weight of bureaucratic preparation or process. But when that determination is made that we should begin preparations for planning, we send an assessment team often on the ground. This assessment team is not 3 or 4, it's 30 or 40 individuals across a range of issues that we now know come together in complex but unmistakable ways to create a fabric for a durable peace over the longer term. That assessment can take anywhere from 2 to 3 or 4 weeks. Comes back, a report is written by the Secretary General to the Council. A mandate is given by the Council, and depending on the political environment of that decision making, it can be more or less expansive, addressing political aspects of reconciliation and forward progress, social economic reform, recovery aspects, and certainly the security and law and order. And then we formulate a budget. I'm required under the rules to prepare and present a budget for every peacekeeping mission within 30 days of the mandate. 30 days, counting weekends. MONUC is over $1 billion. Sudan is larger than MONUC. It's an extraordinary challenge that we have to face, and we don't meet the deadlines, as you might not be surprised. There is an emphasis in UN peacekeeping on integrated missions to bring together these political, economic, and social recovery and security strands, to bring together all of the assets of the international community manifest through the United Nations, be it development or humanitarian or peace and security, to bring all of it to bear in an integrated mission under the leadership of a single SRSG. And we are only approximately successful in our efforts on creating integrated missions with unity of effort in the kind of collaborative and cooperative ways that can help manage down a conflict more effectively and perhaps quickly than if we're all in disparate groups. We're only partially successful here. But as I mentioned to you, our environments are remote. The lines of communication are literally hundreds of kilometers long. There are no markets, no vendors, no raw materials, no food, no infrastructure, housing, communications, and water. And I can tell you the rules under which I operate require that I have 3 vendors for every potential source of supply. There are no 3 vendors in Juba for anything. So it would be nice. I have a set of rules on the one hand that's written as if I were operating in Midtown Manhattan. By the way, that's where I operate out of. But we don't have that kind of a robust market. We certainly don't have, in all of our cases, supportive governments that have created regulatory frameworks for commercial transactions that give you some reliability that the service or the good for which you are transacting will be delivered in this lifetime, according, even remotely resembling the specification you laid out. And did I mention that there's no water? What have we done without? There is worse. As we do UN peacekeeping, again, what we don't have may be more remarkable than what we do have, or may make it even more remarkable of what we are able to do. We have no intelligence capacity in the United Nations. We have no standing strategic planning capacity. Up until very recently, that is to say very recently, 18 months ago, we had no doctrine written down. We had no templates at all for a mission. So at some level we confronted every mission as if for the first time. We had no standing forces, as you know. We have no standing cadres of career professionals. And we have no systematic required training. And as I mentioned to you, we now have 100,000, but we effectively manage 200,000 peacekeepers through our missions every single year. And we don't have any of these things that anyone in an established military, that anyone in an established bureaucracy would recognize as essential to successful operations. Nevertheless, our job is to mount and sustain these operations in the field, recruit and retain high-quality people. I have, at any given time, about a 30% vacancy rate in the field in my international staff. I have over 7,000 international personnel, and I can't keep them. Other agency funds and programs offer better terms and conditions. NGOs offer better terms and conditions. People get highly trained and qualified, and then they're gone. It's enormously difficult. We have to provide timely and comprehensive services and supplies. Gravel. I have to buy gravel. I have to buy aggregate. I have to build roads. In some cases, hundreds of kilometers of roads. Build roads to get to our sites. I drill boreholes. I have water processing plants. I have bakeries. We have almost everything you can imagine in peacekeeping missions. We need to ensure continuous and reliable voice, data, and video communications with all of our mission locations. We tragically lost 2 peacekeepers who were butchered in the Congo 3 years ago, in part because of a lack of good communications infrastructure to meet these the remotest places around the world. And we need to ensure the responsible stewardship of the funds that have been entrusted to us. Try and have an accounting system out in Bunia. When you have no idea whether or not you will have an internet connection, or batteries will arrive on the plane because the tarmac needed to be repaired again at night, as it needs to be repaired every night in Bunia. On the substantive side, we do political facilitation, public administration. We monitor agreements and the parties' compliance. We do policing, as I mentioned, both community policing, training, cadre building, and the institutionalization of law and order practice. We do disarmament, demobilization, and we set the stage so that other parts of the UN system can do the reintegration and repatriation, if necessary, of formerly warring combatants. We do human rights witnessing and monitoring. We do elections again and again and again. In one 12-month period, we concluded 9 elections, including the first elections ever in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the history of that country since independence. That means we really need the ability to anticipate without prejudging, respond to unforeseen circumstances. I can tell you there was not one person in this room, there was not one person on the planet who would have predicted that the United Nations has one of its largest peacekeeping missions in southern Lebanon before the end of 2006. There's not one person on the planet who saw that coming. And we have to do that and prepare a budget in 30 days. We have to innovate a lot. We have to deliver services because it's people like us out there at the remote end of supply chains who depend and whose lives depend on our ability to get there. And we have to account. What are the challenges? The challenges, as I mentioned, are the conditions on the ground. It's finding troop contributing countries. Every single time we set up a new mission, we have to go to the troop contributing countries and say, can you give me an infantry brigade? Do you have attack helicopters? Do you have engineering units? Can I get a level 2 hospital? Every single time we do this from scratch. We have no standing forces. We also have the challenge of evolving mandates. Mandates can evolve sometimes in 3 or 6 month periods, expanding the expectations of the mission performing on the ground while we're still trying to set it up. So not only do we have, again, the problem of overstretch and oversubscription, we have the problem of simultaneity. And when things happen simultaneously, it has a weird effect on decision making. It somehow elevates the importance of relatively minor and obscure problems because you're searching for consistency. And it actually retards your ability to deal with very difficult and big complex problems, again, because there is so much going on at once and there's so much in prospect. I can tell you right now, this is a department that for the past 3 years has been surging in peacekeeping every single year. We are currently standing up 3 missions simultaneously, and there are 3 missions that are on the next hill, exerting a gravitational pull, already requiring that we have people out doing assessments, out doing negotiations and engagement at a political level and operational level as well. What are the conditions for success with peacekeeping? My glib answer to that is leaders who can deliver. If we had leaders who could deliver, that would be a real bonus. Frankly, what we need is the commitment of the parties. We need the party, and there is no substitution for that. And in that, the leaders who can deliver is actually a manifestation of that, but not always. We need international follow-through, and for this reason, you know, the United Nations has recently agreed to establish the Peace Building Commission, which is designed to do just that, to stay with the problem, to help ensure definitive recovery from conflict. When do we fail? We fail when we fail to strengthen the center. That is for sure. We fail when we fail to control external sources of trouble. Again, political influences, monetary and financial influences, and military influence as well, both in terms of fighters and arms and ammunition. And we fail when we quit before the job is done. Now, does that mean that peacekeepers need to stay there in perpetuity? Absolutely not. One of the things that the international community can do through the UN is evolve its presence. It's actually one of our comparative advantages. How good is the UN for these kinds of tasks? How good are we at it? You know, quite frankly, we're better at it than anybody else. And that may not be saying much. But I can tell you fundamentally, this is hard work. This is really very difficult. This is as hard as it gets in terms of international policy problems, helping a society definitively recover from conflict, understanding your role as an external actor. And many people say, you know, there's something fundamentally wrong with the UN. That may be right. What may be fundamentally wrong with the UN is the fact that the 45 consensus has vanished. The consensus that gave rise to this organization in 1945 among the 51 states who came together in San Francisco with an idea to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, that consensus around sovereign equality, around the prohibition on the use of force for illegitimate purposes, that has suffered an enormous difficulty over the past. That consensus has really suffered over decades of a variety of factors. The process of decolonialization, the introduction of member states that some have argued have varying degrees of commitment to core charter principles and values, of the sheer volume of work and expectations that is given to the United Nations today. And the work of the Security Council very fundamentally has changed. It was originally designed as an organization to deal with the relations between and among member states. But frankly, overwhelmingly, the work of the Council today is about the affairs that go on within states. This is no longer new territory for the United Nations, but is territory that has presented an enormous burden and a burden of expectations and performance that perhaps no single organization can meet. What is the UN's value? The UN's value very fundamentally stems from its legitimacy. You may not like the Council. You may disagree with its composition. You may believe it's outdated. But when the Council speaks to put a peacekeeping mission in place, by and large, no one questions the legitimacy of that mission. It's a powerful tool. It has the ability, the UN, we in peacekeeping, together with our partners in the development and humanitarian worlds and our implementing partners in NGOs and regional organizations, we have the ability to manage complexity. It is not always pretty. In fact, it's very often very ugly. But we can manage and mobilize complexity across a range of functional areas, through levels of governance, ranging from non-governmental actors to subnational, national, regional, and international. We can mobilize and manifest the intention of the international community, however imperfectly. The UN can do it in a way that no one else can. Regional organizations may be able to bring to bear political facilitation or may be able to put forces on the ground, but no one can bring the full array of political, economic, and social recovery and peace and security aspects collectively as a single institution. The UN can, and the UN has staying power. The international community can, as I said earlier, evolve its presence and stay with a problem, because many countries are willing to come, but they're not always willing to stay. But then someone will take their place through the UN. And the United Nations can engage with a problem with good offices and peace building, perhaps with a peacekeeping mission evolving to a development and peace building mission over the longer term. So that is the challenge, and that is, I suppose, the privilege of being a UN peacekeeper. I mean, there's some very fundamental truths that I've learned over the course of my years in UN peacekeeping. One, first and foremost, perhaps, is that wars are known not just by what they destroy, but by what they create. A new opportunity, a better day, a more hopeful way of life. Ultimately, it's peace that distinguishes war. And as part of that peace, UN peacekeeping takes its role. And the combination in UN peacekeeping of soldiers who go to these places expecting the worst humanity has to offer, and civilians who go to these places believing in the best humanity has to offer, is a powerful, powerful combination. And I'm privileged to be a part of it. Thanks very much.
When you have someone in charge of logistics and so forth, you want them to be exact, and so we asked Jane Holl Lute to speak for 40 minutes, and she spoke for exactly 40 minutes. That was remarkable. I've never seen that in my life. Okay. We have about 40 minutes now for questions, and when you're how could there be questions? When you're recognized, I would just ask that you identify yourself and any relevant affiliation. I'd also just once again like to thank our speaker for coming down. As you see, her job is to make sure that the trains run on time and everything is there, and she has a million balls in the air at one time. And so to take time out of her schedule to come down here is really remarkable, and we appreciate it, and we understand why you're getting cell phone calls all the time during the day.
I have a 2.5-year-old.
Oh, that's it. There we go. Just one other comment is I think an indicator of that underscores how you work in these far-flung places is the fact that you throw out a bunch of names that, unless you work in the field, probably most folks don't know where these places are. So when she says Juba, right, Southern Sudan. When she says Bunia, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. So most people don't know where they are. You have to get everything there on time. Okay, the first question will go to the Dean of the LBJ School.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Jane, for a characteristically brilliant and powerful account. And it really is, the world is very fortunate that somebody like you is willing to take on what is arguably one of the most thankless tasks. As I told your former boss, the former Secretary General, that his is even more thankless than yours. But there are a lot of rich and interesting questions that your talk raised. But I want to ask you about the one that's often very at the core of these discussions, and you put a lot of emphasis on it, which is the centrality that you placed on the role of a peace to keep, an agreement, a willingness of the parties to deal with the problem. At one level, of course, it's semantic. The Department of Peacekeeping Operations must have something to do with keeping the peace. But I guess I could be a little fast on and say, does that mean there ought to be also a UN Department of War fighting operations? Because there are obviously some circumstances in which there isn't a peace and yet there's a problem. And is it right that we leave to either individual nations or coalitions of the willing or regional organizations like NATO the role of ending conflicts, and then have this bright line in which we then say, okay, now the UN comes in? You talked about some of the comparative advantages that the UN brings, but after all, the first exercise of the UN was a warfighting operation in Korea. And one could imagine an argument that says, why is it that the British, for example, had to intervene in Sierra Leone and not the UN? Or why did it make sense for the British to intervene to create the conditions of peace in Sierra Leone, and then afterwards turn the Soviet to become an operation? And so is it a capabilities thing? Is it a political thing? But what if the UN were, in fact, to conclude, as it did in United for Peace, that there was an interest under the Charter to intervene, and so I go back to the question, should there be a companion Department of Warfighting Operations, or should we think about, how central is it that we say that when it's the UN there has to be peace, when others do it, there are circumstances when force might be necessary that isn't a peace?
Do you want to take some, or
No, why don't you?
As the Lutes have a Department of Warfighting and the Department of Peacekeeping. In the interest of full disclosure, my husband's in the Army. He is the Director of Operations on the Joint Staff in Washington. So as he said to me the other day, okay, enough chit-chat. Let's go back to managing the spectrum of conflict. You to your end, me to mine. It's a really interesting, I think, an important question. I don't think we're not, peacekeepers are not good warfighters when you send them in to do peacekeeping. The UN is not the right organization to go to for war fighting. If we believe, as Rupert Smith says, that the use of force's purpose really changed, it no longer is applied to decide the matter, but rather to set conditions so that the matter can be decided by other means. it doesn't in any way reduce the potency, lethality, or destructive power of war. And it seems to me fundamentally that we want to assure ourselves that we have good controls over that lethality, because we live in an age when when our weapons no longer limit our ability to destroy. I mean, it used to be the case that, bows and arrows could shoot so far, or rifles could shoot so, artillery rounds, 30 kilometers, the whole thing, which we know. But we live in an age effectively when the destructive power of our weaponry is not a real constraining factor in the extreme on our ability to destroy things and decide the matter. So at some level, the international community has not arrived yet at the point of agreement where collective decision-making over lethality for the purposes of warfighting is superior to national decision-making. There certainly has been resistance to creating a standing force even for the purposes of peacekeeping in the United Nations. Many people believe that idea is an idea whose time has come. Others believe it's still an idea ahead of its time. I can give you some examples. We have operated collectively, for example, in the Eastern Congo with Congolese armed forces to support them as they have taken on more robust actions to rid areas of marauding militias and others. There are some real operational problems with it from a very practical point of view, but I think we haven't crossed the conceptual barrier into seeing that collective decision-making over warfighting is, in these circumstances, superior to national control. So no, I don't think there should be a UN Department of War Making, for the record.
Other questions? Also, anybody who's sitting on the ground or standing, there are a couple seats still around the table, so please feel free to come on up and make yourself comfortable. Questions?
I'm Bill Brands in the History Department. When your organization takes on a peacekeeping mission, is any thought given up front to an exit strategy, how to terminate this operation?
Yes.
And what form does that usually take? Does it work itself out in the 30-day window that you have to prepare these things?
Yeah. You're talking to somebody who wrote their Ph.D. dissertation on how wars end, why they end when they do, why they don't end sooner, how military factors and progress on the battlefield influence political decision-making back in capitals. You learn some pretty interesting things, and when I was in the desert in 1991, that was the issue I worked on. Can we stop now? Have we met our military objectives? And the most important war termination decision is the war design decision. If you take that hill, does that mean you won? And what's the hill? And what does winning mean? You really do learn some interesting things. You learn that soldiers and civilians look at battlefield progress really very differently. Soldiers evaluate battlefield progress retrospectively. Look how far we've come. Civilians evaluate battlefield progress prospectively. Yeah, but look how far you have to go. It's a really very interesting dynamic and interplay. And it means that military achievements on the ground are measurable in terms unrelated to what's happening on the ground. And nowhere is that more true than peacekeeping. I said earlier that our development colleagues, to the extent they have success, it's not in what they are able to do programmatically or in terms of institution building, but ultimately what society and its leadership is able to do on their own behalf. In the case of a peacekeeping mission, the council, at some level you can be glib and say, well, the council determines that a problem constitutes a threat to international peace and security. And so when that problem no longer constitutes a threat to international peace and security, we can withdraw the peacekeeping mission. Sierra Leone is an example of that, where a peacekeeping mission was withdrawn. Burundi, an example of that, where it was placed in and now withdrawn. But that doesn't mean the international community's engagement goes away. So the measure may be perhaps an intangible one. It may be rather the collective estimate of progress and factors in a number of areas. No one would say, for example, Sierra Leone is out of the woods and there is definitive recovery from conflict and it's not vulnerable both to its internal pressures and processes and to proximate pressures and processes from neighboring countries and the disputes that exist there. Now, but by and large, it is the notion that we need to manage down this conflict and help the parties make progress along in a direction and via a political process which they have themselves established as legitimate with the help of the international community, so that the problem no longer constitutes a threat to international peace and security.
Eugene Goltz from the LBJ School. And I'm going to say, I'm hoping a lot of students are going to chime in later, but I'm taking up your time first, and I apologize for that. But I want to go back to your little conversation about a theory of remedy, because that strikes me as a very important insight, an important thing that seems to be missing. We say, oh, send the peacekeepers, how are they going to fix the problem? But your definition of peacekeeping struck me as, I may have it a little bit wrong, but somehow an intervening force that protects a fragile peace, right? So the reason that what matters about peacekeeping is there is a peace, but it's fragile. There's a threat to that peace that somehow could be ameliorated or addressed by the international force coming in. And if I think about things that might make a peace fragile, I can think of a whole bunch of things that would make a peace fragile that I can't imagine an international force coming in having much connection to redressing or ameliorating. So there could be a peace, people could want peace, but it's fragile because of it's easy to tip the balance. A slight change in the economic situation would advantage one side and lead them to go on the offense or to seek retribution. It's easy to mistake bad intention, something bad happening, you blame it on the other people, and those are not things that are whether they're history or culture or economic or weapons that quickly tip the balance, a whole set of things where there could be a fragile peace that's easily tipped. I just don't see what intervening forces have to do with whether the peace is going to collapse. And so I'd love it if you would tell me a little more about, well, what are the range of things? Well, first, have I characterized things right? But then also, what are the range of things that make peace fragile that intervention does address?
I certainly can't give you an exhaustive inventory of what makes peace fragile. In our environments, peace is often, more in promise than in practice as a peacekeeping mission comes in. You have societies or leaders or factions, who are experimenting with an alternative way to realize, their at some level deepest aspirations, at some level very shallow aspirations. But you have fundamentally a commitment there, a weariness to conflict, but a vulnerability to renewed conflict, because that has been a matter that at a very, very venal level, perhaps, in many of these conflicts has generated the way you get stuff, or you get stuff done through violence. It is simply not the case that peace will keep itself in these environments. It sounds trite, and as Jim said, it's almost tautological to say, a peacekeeping mission needs a peace to keep. Well, that's right, it does. What's key there is the political process. A peacekeeping mission can't just represent the shutting of doors. There has to be an opening of windows, and an opening of windows in a very genuine way that the parties themselves recognize as legitimate and as viable pathways or transmission belts to realizing their aspirations. Peacekeepers on the ground, they provide. It's an extraordinary thing to see. I've been with peacekeepers when we first entered in or come into an area where we haven't been before. People believe that someone has come to help us. Now we have, in all cases, as you know, and I should be upfront about this in peacekeeping, not distinguished ourselves. We have violated the duty of care with which we have been entrusted. And you'll know about the sexual exploitation and abuse scandal that has rocked peacekeeping and tarnished our image. But it should not obscure really the fact that tens of thousands of women, men and women over decades have served honorably in peacekeeping mission, and they come in a way that is both reassuring and stabilizing. Now, is it because that individual peacekeeper is somehow breaking the doors down to resistance? No, it's really more, again, of the accumulation of factors, the conditions that are created on the ground that allow peoples to take matters back into their own hands in less violent ways than before, and it does accumulate. What you know is that peace and the benefits of peace accumulate, but it's a very vulnerable accumulation. And things, we talk about things, for example, operational aspects, and maybe that's what I'm preoccupied with these days. For example, we need to address the needs of the populations in cities right away. Well, that's great because that's where the population concentrations are. But if you don't stabilize rural populations before you address the city needs, you will have higher populations in your cities. And peacekeepers can bring attention to that fact. We know that elections are valuable, and elections are fundamentally stabilizing up until they're occurred, up until they occur. Then they're actually destabilizing, But peacekeepers can provide a reassuring, visible presence that it's not actually really what's interesting. The first election is not particularly interesting to me. The second election is. Do the conditions still exist? Do people still have confidence in the prospect of a political process serving their interests? And the presence and activities of peacekeepers in all of these issues help contribute to that.
In the back.
I want to thank you so much for coming to UT and speaking. I myself feel very uninformed about the specifics of what the UN actually does, but I was curious how much value or emphasis is placed when you enter a new mission or site on protecting the cultural, religious, and historical areas of a community, such as mosques or synagogues or libraries and museums?
Some. It's not on. It's probably not the top 10 priorities of a peacekeeping mission coming into town, but it's not absent either. People are very aware of the importance of symbols. It's a way in which they feel as though their identity and livelihood can be preserved. So at a very interesting level, it's more manifest tactically and operationally. When peacekeepers come into a village or a town or an area, they learn the important valued sites. Where is the marketplace? How do you get there? This community has had its bridges blown. Can we restore those bridges? These are sacred sites, or these are sacred days where people need the latitude to practice, whatever their cultural or religious customs are. Peacekeepers usually become very quickly attuned in the immediate area of the localized, not the localized nature of it, but the localized manifestations of these very important sites to local populations. But in terms of the overall strategic direction setting of the peacekeeping mission, some people have accused the Security Council of layering on mandates and missions, child protection, human rights observation, holding elections, public administration, policing law and order, et cetera, and adding this as another layer. But in practical fact, it is a reality of peacekeeping life on the ground to be knowledgeable and attentive to these very sensitive issues.
Jane, I just thought that was a terrific talk.
Who are you?
I'm Frank Gavin. Jane was actually, when we talked earlier, she was involved in a project I held, the Next Generation Project in Assembly. And Jane was far and away out of the 60 Next Generation Fellows the most interesting and compelling. And you can see why. So it's terrific to learn all this from you. The two factors that really struck me in your talk were first, the absolute vulnerability that the peacekeepers face in these environments. And the second, sort of adding to that, was their dependence on others and your dependence on others. And as I was thinking to myself, I thought, there must be a lot of situations where there's a party to the peace that has enormous incentives to delegitimize or undermine the operation. So that's got to be something that you're constantly worried about. And then I thought, well, what would you need to deal with that? You would need intelligence capabilities. And you don't have intelligence capabilities. You're dependent on others. And so I was wondering, how do you manage that? Do you rely on the member states to provide the information? How do you assess, while the operation is going on, whether it's a success, whether there are dangers coming, whether do the member states have an obligation to tell you? Do you work out arrangements? If you see something scary or bad happening, do you report back? How does that process work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You couldn't even use the word intelligence in the context of talking about UN peacekeeping only a few years ago. But now you can. And in fact, member states have really endorsed the idea of giving a tactical intelligence capacity to peacekeeping operations to give what we might call in the U.S. Army, near real-time battle space awareness, of what's happening, sort of to your front and to your sides. or near real-time operating space awareness, I should say. What do we do? What do we do right now? I mean, we rely on NGOs that have been operating there. We rely on local authorities. We rely on people who work for us of the local population. I had a very interesting conversation with an NGO, and this NGO paid people to find out where bad guys were so that they can conduct their operations in relative safety. And then they reported that the same guy was being paid by the bad guys to give information on where the NGO was so they could capitalize on their food stocks and other humanitarian deliverables. It's true that not everyone views the introduction of a peacekeeping mission as an unalloyed good. And so what we really need to do is to understand our environments. And the UN actually has a very good ability to do that, given the nature of our organization and the way we put operations in place on the ground. But it's not perfect by a long shot. I mean, a lot of military commanders, from a number of militaries would be frustrated at frankly, what we don't know about when we're operating there, particularly when you're planning operations that can make a difference. There are environments where even talking about intelligence capacity or what the UN is able to know is an extremely sensitive issue. Southern Lebanon is a clear example of that. But all the more important that UNIFIL be able to fulfill its role because it has a good idea of what's happening, what's not happening, what should be happening in its area of responsibility.
I mean, the other point you maybe you could expand upon is the fact that while the UN may not have formal intelligence infrastructure, no self-respecting state is going to contribute troops without having its own organic intelligence component. And so what you have is intelligence officers in the field, but they're not reporting to their UN headquarters, they're reporting to their national headquarters. How do you deal with that, and how do you try to coordinate that? Is it getting any better? I mean, it was certainly felt to be scandalous in some early interventions in the 90s. Right. Is it getting any better?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, I think, if countries are reporting back to national channels, that's a reality of life, not only for us, but any other regional organization. But our ability to understand what's happening in our area of operations is actually not perfect by a long shot, but we don't suffer from the problem of member states sort of withholding vital operational information as a chronic aspect limiting our ability to operate. I mean, part of our problem is, we deploy into areas, like as I mentioned, there's a brigade in the Eastern Congo with an area of responsibility that's larger than Rwanda and Burundi combined. I mean, just the sheer magnitude of the challenge. And the resourcing of peacekeeping, while significant, $7 billion is a lot of money. I mean, we could approach 9 if these new missions come to pass. I mean, we need to really put this in perspective. I mean, the U.S. will spend more money in Iraq this week than on UN peacekeeping all year long. And it spent more money in Iraq last year than on UN peacekeeping since 1948. And so when you talk about the resourcing and a robust peacekeeping mission, I mean, there are operational realities here. The Congo is considered one of our most robust missions. We have just over 16,000 troops on the ground. I could put every single one of those troops somewhere in the Congo and set every one of you in this room loose for the rest of your lives. You'd never find one. Sudan is larger than Congo. So it's not just an intelligence capabilities issue here, I think is the point I want to make.
Miriam Estrin, I'm an undergraduate. I guess I'm surprised that there haven't been more efforts to bolster the regional organizations or sub-regional organizations, especially in cases like Sudan, where the government has refused to let in UN peacekeepers, but might allow something like the African Union. So, especially in light of that case, has there been more effort to bolster regional organizations? And a separate question, with all of your short time lengths to prepare peacekeeping operations, has anyone given any thought to maybe having an independent advisory council to the Security Council, maybe of non-UN experts to advise on peacekeeping operations?
With respect to regional organizations, in fact, that's a real going concern. The U.S. bilaterally has made a priority of strengthening African peacekeeping through the AU and other mechanisms. We've established a formal liaison capacity with the AU in Addis, actually, linked back to New York, to strengthen the way we interoperate. We now have a lot of experience in operating with the African Union on the ground in Africa, and efforts are underway to bolster that capacity. There are some who think that the African ability to operate on the ground is some time away from reaching UN standards or UN levels, but nevertheless, progress is being made in that direction. A standing, wise men council to advise on peacekeeping, I don't know about, but from time to time, commissions have been established to look at peacekeeping. I mean, most famously, of course, was the one headed by Lakhdar Brahimi in the year 2000, which led to the so-called peacekeeping reforms. I mean, thank God for Brahimi. In 2000, when Brahimi conducted his report, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations was 400 people. After Brahimi reforms, we rocketed to 600. Rocketed to 600. And right now, there are 688 professionals and staff in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in the United Nations, period. That's not a bloated bureaucracy.
Tony Renz, you're a retired Air Force officer. With all of those operations and all those troops you have going out in the field, do you operate a 24-hour command and control center?
It's a situation center. Command and control, by and large, centralized or reporting to the Department of Peacekeeping, to the Secretary General through the Department of Peacekeeping. The Situation Center functions pretty much just as that, tapping onto the situation. It also represents a physical location for the command and control in crises. For example, when we were engaged on literally no notice to evacuate Charles Taylor to the special court in Sierra Leone, we operated right out of there.
Where is that located?
In New York.
My name is Brian Hammonds. I'm a frustrated taxpayer. I've seen so much money going to Iraq. I like your point earlier about the comparison of how much you're spending and how much we're spending in Iraq. But my question is, your role in helping to establish reconciliation procedures, something similar to what's going on in Chile and South Africa and many other countries. There seems to be a new wave of activity that follows violence and civil war and so on. What role do you see your peacekeeping operations beginning to fringe or overlap with that?
Those taxes being paid to Washington or Pretoria? No, just joking.
I am an American citizen.
Let me just use this opportunity to say up front something. I was not trying to be critical of the United States. I'm very proud to be an American. I'm very proud to be an American at the United Nations. In my view, the United Nations has no more important member than the United States. And we could not succeed if it were not for the political commitment and engagement of the United States in the operations that we pursue. And I know you weren't making that point, but sometimes when people hear, you're talking about the United Nations and the United States, they can hear a critical voice. I mean, that to me is just facts. What I was trying to make a point on was the relative expenditure that's devoted to UN peacekeeping, because we're often criticized these days as an a bloated, out-of-control bureaucracy. It's not the case in peacekeeping. If anything, we're dangerously thin, in my view. There are, and there is. I'm losing track here of my grammar. We're witnessing a real period of innovation in processes of reconciliation with parties and how to engage. Sort of maybe coming back to this notion of remedy. What's the appropriate way for the international community to mobilize its resources to address this problem? There's plenty of work to go around, but there's not equal comfort with all the work that's being done. You know that there are non-governmental organizations who are engaging in these processes to help facilitate and create the conditions so that more formalized processes engaging governments can happen. There have been a variety of reconciliation mechanisms in South Africa, of course. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an institutionalized way of trying to help a society emerge from its sort of expose its internal demons and have a conversation with itself in ways that don't perpetuate the self-destructive nature of the conflict. The UN is obviously a big part of that. There's an effort to strengthen our capacity to do mediation and good offices, to do preventive diplomacy. It's quite different to stop a fight from breaking out than it is from mopping up after one has concluded. this represents a distinct, to me, very interesting set of challenges. There is no more higher purpose of the United Nations than to prevent the outbreak and spread and continuation of violence. I mean, we act as if war is the weather, and whenever it breaks out, there's nothing we can do except get wet. And what the international community has, I think, come to the realization, and now through very creative efforts on the ground, including through the United Nations in part, is to engage with these reconciliation processes. Again, recognizing that the parties can't always do what it takes to come together themselves. If any of you have children, you know exactly what I mean. I mean, not to trivialize the issue, but sometimes you are so mad, that you can't, or they're so mad at each other, And we sometimes plague ourselves with the ability to understand root causes before we can effectively engage. We didn't have to know precisely what was it about the interaction between nicotine and lung tissue to know that if you smoked, you increased your chances of cancer. We didn't have to know precisely about why if you brushed your teeth, you stood a better chance of keeping them in your head than if you didn't. And similarly, with international conflict and issues of core disputes among people, there are things that we can do to engage preventively. And so in my view, some of the most imaginative work is being done in the area of preventive diplomacy and reconciliation.
I will abuse the chair by asking a question myself, and it's intended a little bit to put you on the spot.
Oh, great.
I just warned you. She asked ahead of time, are there any landmines out there? I said, just me. In peace operations, there is a premium on speed. I hope you'll agree with me. In either of two kinds of peace operations, one is you have some sort of peace agreement and you're trying to get there to, as you say, protect and strengthen fragile peace. But in that little window before you get there, there's nobody to protect that fragile peace. So you want to get there as quickly as possible, make the window as small as possible. Or in the case where you're trying to destroy evil, as you say, that is, something's going on, maybe a genocide. And you want to get your troops there as quickly as possible. The quicker you get there, probably the more lives you save. And that's why there's been so much pressure for so many years about some kind of standing UN force, some kind of rapid reaction force. But as you said in your talk, it's not politically feasible today, in part because countries want to maintain sovereignty over the use of their own forces, their own national forces. So they're not going to pre-commit or donate troops in advance when they don't even know what the mission might be down the road. So my question is, there are two possible ways maybe around this. And so far, the UN hasn't adopted either. And I'm wondering if you could give me, as frank as possible on the open record, your views of these. One would be, rather than pre-donated national forces, essentially a UN Foreign Legion. That is, individual citizens who say, I really care about what's going on in Darfur. I'm going to enlist in the UN. Okay, and I'm going to be, you call me, and I'm there that day. So, and my guess is if you put out the call, you'd get thousands, if not tens of thousands of people around the world would enlist in this force. That's option one. Option two is privatization. That is, and I'm guessing, if I scratched you, that if you could pick up the phone and call Blackwater, right, and say, I need a brigade with Hilo air power, and I need them there in 3 days, you might want to be able to do that. That is, Blackwater is a private military corporation. It looks a heck of a lot like a first-class military. The only thing is it doesn't work for government. It works for profit. So please give me your views on both of these alternatives so that we could get there quicker.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, at the heart of what you're asking is a very serious set of questions. Let me address the first one on the Foreign Legion. Would there be tens of thousands of people signing up? Maybe. The world's got 6 billion people on the planet. So my suspicion is there would be tens of thousands of people growing up. But I was trained in a very special army as a young lieutenant. I was trained in an army that had come out of the experience of Vietnam, deeply affected by that experience, and emerged with an approach to warfighting and organizing to fight that is a hallmark, in my view, of the American way of war. Came out, it was originally based on 3 ideas. Learn how to fight, write the doctrine down, train very well, buy good equipment. We built on that model and built and placed an emphasis on high-quality, trained leadership, on sustainability, and on a number of other factors, or right organization, and training to the fight. So much so that by the time Desert Storm came around in the early 1990s, in my view, the American Army didn't think about deploying soldiers. It was deploying military solutions. It was a well-crafted, well-organized, well-trained, well-led, well-equipped force able to do the job it was asked to do. You don't throw force at problems. There's a very interesting book by Dick Treffery, and I don't even know it's available anymore, How to Build an Army. And I remember reading it once. It's a lot harder than it looks. So it's a lot more than 10,000 people showing up and saying, send me. Although I can tell you, to this day, I still have that impulse from time to time. Send me. And I know it. That's not the simple answer to the UN's problems. There's an old adage, you want it bad, you get it bad. And that might not be the right approach. Now take the other instance, call Blackwater. I'll call India. I'll call Pakistan. We'll call Bangladesh. We'll call Jordan. We'll call Uruguay. We'll call the member states who represent the membership of the United Nations. When you talk about privatizing or the use of force, of course, I would like to be able to use private firms from time to time to provide security in very dangerous settings. We had 22 of our colleagues killed for absolutely no reason other than they were doing their jobs in Iraq on August 19, 2003. I would have loved to have a private security firm or any security firm at the time to protect them from the ill that was intended them. Their fate was not their due for what they were doing. The answer is not to throw money at this problem. The answer, in my view, is not to disperse lethality and its control, to the highest bidder or to the most viable commercial firm. There is a normative component to UN operations, which I think is an important component of those operations and an important aspect of our legitimacy. And so if we're going to do this, every idea whose time has come began as an idea ahead of its time. And with a UN standing force, we are somewhere on that continuum.
And the same with the use of private military corporations for security or other operations?
Yeah, I think we are not.
Maybe a good idea, but ahead of its time?
I think if the idea is concentrated, rapidly deployable firepower under a moment's notice, under clear command and control guidelines, is a great idea. Is Blackwater are they that idea? No, there's a long way between the capabilities that Blackwater represent and the kind of command and control, political oversight, accountability, and responsiveness that the world has come to expect when it comes together in the United Nations to act in peacekeeping.
We have time for one more question. So we have 2, so we'll take both of them. Okay, we'll take Nikki, and then I saw that hand next. And so why don't we, and there's one of the, how about we take all 3, they're going to be very quick questions, I know that. We'll take all 3 together, and then you give one answer to all. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Thank you for indulging us. Okay, so we'll go Nikki, and then you, and then in the back. Go.
Thanks. My name is Nikki. I'm a second year student. In situations where there is no peace to keep, I'm wondering when it becomes the role of the United Nations, or if this role exists for the United Nations, for them to, at some point, create a peace to keep, either through fostering peace agreements or even through relying on something like Chapter 7 and perhaps inducing that sort of Chapter 7 mandate with use of force.
Okay.
I'm from Croatia. I was just wondering, are there some specific things that go into the decision for entering a peacekeeping mission? Like, when do you decide it's time absolutely to go in? Sometimes countries, ask for help, sometimes they don't, but at what point do you decide, okay, it's time for us to step in?
Ma'am, my name is Adam Chikansky. I'm a graduate student and also an officer in the Army.
Cool.
And I enjoyed the answer to the last question. I thought it was very appropriate. But my question deals with the fact that You brought up there's a short list of countries that are willing to actually donate or put forth forces for these missions. I think it's a lot easier to put money forward. All that's needed, it's a lot easier to put money forward than it is to put the soldiers forward. You mentioned there's a short list of countries that historically donate those soldiers. My question is, do you have any kind of strategy, or is there any way we can expand that list so there's more equitable showing of forces from countries around the world instead of the same countries always putting forward these forces?
Yeah, thanks very much. Can the UN engage to help keep a peace? Yeah, diplomatically, politically, as a forum for dialogue. But as war fighters to install peace, the UN is not the answer. UN peacekeeping force is not the answer to come in and mow down belligerents and say, okay, everybody quiet. It's a very serious question. It's one that people ask all the time. That's why I tried to outline for you, in my sense, what the conditions are under which a peacekeeping mission is properly introduced. When do we decide? We don't decide. We don't get, we don't choose any of our peacekeeping missions in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. It's the Security Council's decision whether or not we go. A variety of factors can combine. There are a number of pathways to Security Council decisions. If we're lacking, though, a theory of remedy about peacekeeping, we're also lacking a theory of limits. People asked back in the 90s, why are we doing Sarajevo? Why aren't we doing Somalia? If we're doing Somalia, why aren't we doing Sudan? We don't have a good theory of limits. How far, how many of these can we do at any given time? And it's a real moral hazard, I think, that goes with the nature of the business. How do we expand the list? Actually, the list is interestingly kind of self-expanding at the moment. A lot of work to go around. That's the problem. There's some interesting innovations going on in peacekeeping right now. For the first time in our history, we have a Navy off the coast of Lebanon. And we had actually no institutionalized expertise for running that Navy. And so we have a number of countries that are back in peacekeeping after a long time away. We have new entries, Qatar, for example, coming into peacekeeping. That represents, both a challenge and a source of some encouragement that everyone is recognizing that only when we pool our strengths can we really share our burdens. And I know that was the last question. I really want to end the way I began, by just paying tribute to the young men and women that are at this moment, like our young soldiers that are out there in the world, thousands and thousands of kilometers from their homes, believing in a cause and a commitment far larger than themselves, and working with each other in ways that I find inspiring every single day. And it's a privilege to be one of their leaders, I suppose, but more important, it's a privilege to be one of their number.
I just want to thank our speaker again for coming down, for being optimistic and at the same time realistic, as you say. For a lot of folks, there is no theory of limits. And as the author of a book called The Limits of Humanitarian Intervention, I agree. We need to think about what we can do, but we have to think about the limits of it so that we don't, through wishful thinking, create more harm than good. I also appreciate your... We have so many speakers who sometimes give answers that are so much longer than the questions that we get very few questions. And so we got a lot of questions in here, and that's a tribute to your concision. And just lastly, as you did for the folks who are in the field, I would like to thank you for your service.
Thank you.